South LA has plenty of secrets nestled away in its 16 square miles. But very few like this one. This is Village Green, a meticulously landscaped condominium community that's nestled behind Obama Boulevard in South LA's Baldwin Hills neighborhood. Within it are thousands of residents and hundreds of families spread across 67 acres, 97 structures, and 627 condominium units. It's also regarded as one of the most ambitious and awarded large-scale housing developments in the nation, being among the first planned communities in the United States that prioritized nature and community over automobiles and roadways. Today, Village Green stands as a multicultural community in the heart of Baldwin Hills, a neighborhood that is facing an identity crisis as its residents tackle new neighbors, rising home prices, and unaccustomed developments. So, what's behind the story of Village Green in South LA, and how does it fit into the crisis that Baldwin Hills faces today? In early 1941, the Los Angeles Times reported on a new housing community called Thousand Gardens, a planned $3.5 million private development at the historic site of Rancho Cienega de Paso de la Tierra in southwest Los Angeles, which was land sold from the estate of E.J. Lucky Baldwin, who owned hundreds of acres of ranch land that has been developed into present-day Baldwin Hills and the Crenshaw neighborhood of South LA. The Los Angeles Times also reported that the money used to finance the Thousand Gardens development was, at the time, the second largest mortgage insured by the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA. FHA mortgage insurance is crucial to the future of Thousand Gardens. As the United States tackled housing shortages in the late 30s and early 40s, a result of the Great Depression, the FHA worked with lending institutions to insure housing loans for single-family homes and large housing developments. The catch, however, is the lender would have to abide by special FHA provisions that were designed to protect the equity in the loan insured. One way the FHA reduced financial risk was through redlining, a practice that marginalized communities based on race and location, two of many factors that the FHA believed could negatively impact property values. In short, Thousand Gardens, like many housing developments in southwest Los Angeles that were backed by the FHA, initially began as racially restrictive, often white-only communities. While the FHA insurance outlines who could live in this development, the Thousand Gardens community was also the result of over 2 years of research on what makes a community a community. The end result was the joint architectural development of planner Clarence Stein, architect Reginald D. Johnson, the Wilson, Merrill, and Alexander of Los Angeles architectural firm, and landscape architect Fred Barlow Jr., who all imagined a low-density, car-free community built around nature. The apartment development made headlines for its amenity-driven and nature-oriented community planning. Journalists raved about the planned underground utilities and new electric and gas appliances. The buildings offered a great deal of privacy, with many units having access to private patios and all units having private entrances. Though one of the most unique factors planned about this development was the fact that it would be a superblock, meaning there would be no internal roadways that would divide the community. Instead, it would just be one cohesive housing development. Emphasizing the importance of nature, the architects reserved roughly 85% of the land for the park-like grounds, and housing occupied the remaining 15%. Construction for the Thousand Gardens started in March of 1941, and within 7 months, the housing development was nearly 75% complete. At the same time, the developers dropped the Thousand Gardens brand and renamed the development the Baldwin Hills Village, which was likely indicative of the flourishing Baldwin Hills neighborhood that had begun to see a great deal of investment. Built in phases, some of the first apartments landed on the rental market in December of 1941. new tenants were welcomed into a country club atmosphere complete with homeownership-like seclusion, hotel-level luxuries, including a 24-hour switchboard service and on-call maid services. In early 1942, the Baldwin Hills Village officially opened its first phase, revealing its lush landscaping, private patio gardens, central clubhouse, and 9 children play areas. During my visit to Village Green in February of 2022, I had the opportunity to speak with a couple of long-term Village Green residents about their experience living in this planned community. I met Joe Corey, a 20-year Village Green resident who learned about this neighborhood from a relative and Leimert Park resident.
What made me fall in love with it was really when my wife and I were getting married. We were looking for a place to live. We wanted to find a place that was diverse, and it's hard to find in LA. So her uncle Truett White, who lived in Leimert Park, he told us that Village Green was at the intersection of rich and white, black and poor. It's an ideal place to raise a family. So he grew up in Leimert Park. Like I said, his family was one of the first African-American families to move in there right after the 1953 Supreme Court decision. So he was very familiar with this area. He used to ride his bike through here as a kid, and he would get chased because then it was racially segregated, and they would, the security would chase him through through the neighborhood. So anyway, that's what attracted us here, was the diversity of the place.
At the start of 1942, the Baldwin Hills Village broke rental records, and by the end of that year, just as the final phases were complete, the Baldwin Hills Village was a handful of tenants away from being fully rented. By 1943, life at Baldwin Hills Village was in full swing. It was a growing community that sat at the crossroads of entertainment and nature. In fact, in 1946, just 4 years after the village was built, architect Reginald D. Johnson and the Wilson, Merrill, and Alexander firm received a distinguished honor from the Southern California chapter of American Institute of Architects for planning the Baldwin Hills Village. Despite the architectural achievement, the Baldwin Village was sold twice within the 1940s. The first acquisition was by the Bankers Life Company of Des Moines, Iowa, in 1944 for $2.6 million. Later, it was sold to the New England Mutual Life Insurance Company of Boston for $4.5 million, a sale that ranked as one of the largest in Southern California at that time. On the Baldwin Hills Village's 20th anniversary in 1962, the apartment development was sold again, but this time it was purchased by Baldwin M. Baldwin. This was the grandson of Lucky E.J. Baldwin, the former owner of the land that the Baldwin Hills Village occupies. While these acquisitions did not impact life at Baldwin Village, it did, however, prove that the Baldwin Village was a profitable asset. And in the late 40s and early 50s, in the hills behind the village, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power began constructing a $5 million man-made water reservoir near a fault line. But the engineers and geologists believed that they could work around it and that it wouldn't be an issue. This is obviously not concerning at all. The man-made reservoirs that the Los Angeles Department and Water and Power built in the hills above the village broke in 1963, and several homes in Baldwin Hills, including those at the Baldwin Hills Village, were damaged in the disaster. The Baldwin Hills Village and the area around it undoubtedly recovered after the Baldwin Hills Reservoir disaster. But by the mid-1960s, the Baldwin Hills neighborhood underwent a dramatic demographic shift. The once white middle-class enclave of Baldwin Hills in southwest Los Angeles quickly became a black neighborhood in South Los Angeles. But that neighborhood shift, however, didn't impact the Baldwin Hills Village the same way. While the Baldwin Hills Village started as a young, family-centered community in the 1940s, it morphed into a white, reclusive superblock in the heart of Black Los Angeles by the 1970s. Like I mentioned earlier, the Baldwin Hills Village was initially bounded by racial restrictions imposed by the FHA. Since then, the development had been bought a handful of times, and by this time, the United States federal government implemented the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Yet, by 1973, the Baldwin Hills Village had 3 confirmed Black families that rented a home in the predominantly white planned community. This storyline of the Baldwin Hills Village changed, however, when developer Turamix acquired the 32-year-old complex from the estate of Baldwin and Baldwin in 1971. While the community being bought and sold was nothing new, this time the developer planned to subdivide the superblock into individual condominiums for sale. Outraged, residents from Baldwin Hills and the impacted Baldwin Hills Village quickly banded together to form the Concerned Citizens of Baldwin Vista, which opposed Turamix's condominium proposal. In a battle of appeals to the city of Los Angeles, the Baldwin Hills Village tenants voiced concerns about being displaced during the conversion process. In fact, the majority of residents preferred to remain as tenants, and as little as 2% actually planned to purchase their apartment unit after the conversion. Turamix positioned itself as anxious to preserve what's there as an example of outstanding community planning, and believed that selling condominiums, not renting them, would help the superblock resolve its diversity issues in the now Black neighborhood of Baldwin Hills. During my research, I met Cynthia Singleton, a 28-year resident of today's Village Green. She bought her home in the mid-90s, but initially faced some discrimination during the buying process of her Village Green home.
Yeah, I encountered that when I bought my unit. I guess she'll hear me from heaven. The lady didn't want to sell me my unit. I encountered that from when I went to buy my unit. When she met me with the realtor, she said, I don't want to sell to that blank. Believe it or not, here in Village Green. And my realtor told her, no, it's illegal, you can't do that. Anyway, I ended up buying it. And her daughter came back to see me and apologize and say, my mother's elderly. I noticed when I moved here, it keeps going through transitions though. But when I moved here, the reason it was predominantly Caucasian was because most of the elderly were here that had bought originally. So as they started passing away and moving and selling, then their children started moving in, and then different people started moving in. So then it became more integrated. And now it's starting to go through a transition again. Due to a gentrification, they say, we're almost 85% Caucasian now. It's changed again. But the people moving in, fortunately, 90% of them have a very broad, welcoming attitude.
In 1973, the Los Angeles Council expressed support for the Baldwin Hills Village condominium conversion despite tenants' appeals. However, Turamix penned an agreement that gave tenants the first option to buy the condos and its promise to maintain the historical integrity of the community as much as possible. Turamix began the conversion process in 1974. In its first act to reinvent the Baldwin Hills Village as condos, it officially renamed the community the Village Green. In the conversion process, Turamix left the architecture, floor plans, and landscaping practically untouched. It did, however, outfit the unit with new appliances, new floors, and new countertop surfaces. Turamix started its conversion process in phases, and advertisements began rolling in, selling the Village Green as an adults-only condominium, while marketing the park-like setting and the central commuting location to a sea of buyers. Those ads generated a lot of attention, and by 1977, 3 years after the start of the conversion process, over half the condominiums were sold. Today, the Village Green remains a vibrant yet tranquil community at the edge of LA's Baldwin Hills neighborhood. Its open fields, private nooks, and thoughtful landscaping make it far too easy to fall in love with this community, and even easier to forget you're standing in South LA. Yet, on the outskirts of the property, rising home prices and general cost of living in Los Angeles have notoriously displaced many in Baldwin Hills. Village Green, however, has found itself in a pivotal moment of its history. It's no longer an elderly, white, adults-only enclave, but a community with a growing population of young professionals, new couples, and budding families. This shift in ownership will continue to determine the outlook of Village Green as the larger Baldwin Hills community continues to reconcile its changing colors.
If we're going to be a model of an integrated racial community, which I think Village Green can be, to our sister communities in South Los Angeles. We can be a model that says a community can transcend barriers of race and class. Like Uncle Truett said, this is the intersection of black and white, rich and poor. That's how he described it. But are we going to let the real estate business operates on that model of segregation? When you ask most people how they found Village Green, they had a friend who lived here and they came here to visit. That's how people find Village Green. So who are we going to invite to visit? Who am I going to invite to come visit Village Green? That's how we're going to build a diverse community.
While Village Green is in constant flux, its historic status will continue to remain still. The Cultural Heritage Board of the City of Los Angeles recognized Village Green as an historic cultural landmark in 1977. The Village Green was also added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1993. And designated as a National Historic Landmark in 2001. At the very least, South LA should be proud to hold such a historically relevant piece of architecture in one of its most prominent neighborhoods. Knowing how pretty Village Green is, I asked Cynthia if she had any words for the viewers if they ever decided to visit, and she did have one thing to say.
I think you should know this is a private property. This is not a park. This is our home. That yard is my front yard. We're welcoming nice people, but this is not a public space. It's a beautiful place to live. I welcome you wholeheartedly if you want to buy, rent, move. It's gorgeous. But let's just keep it gorgeous. When you move here, I hope that you will have the attitude to say, I didn't come to change it, I came to enjoy it.
I've seen a lot of change, been through a lot of pain. Some things are not the same as they were a year ago, but all will be okay. I move on each and every day. The past is where it stays, way back a year ago. I've changed for the better this time. I thought I would never be fine. I strive just to say I'm alright, and for the first time in a long time I'm alright. I've seen a lot of change, been through a lot of pain. Some things are not the same as they were a year ago.